So apologies, I lost the audio for the introduction, so I'm just going to talk over and tell you basically what I'm saying is the project this week is going to be a quick one video project. It was an architectural rebuild of some old exterior porch railings for someone who I've done work for before. So he basically dropped off these railings. They had a ton of termite damage, so figuring out where bits and pieces went was a little bit complicated, but I really enjoy these architectural restorations, or in this situation, I prefer to remake the entire thing versus restore it. I like the reverse engineering aspect of these builds. So you can see the panel that I made is behind me, and part of the panels that he dropped off is to the left in the video. There were two panels, one's about 8 feet long, the other one's about 5 feet long. So he, like I said, he dropped them off. There's a little bit still missing from this, but that's just because we have a couple more things to do, and then he's going to be painting them, so I didn't have to paint them. But that's basically what I was getting at in the intro. So on builds like this, the customer usually wants to keep the historical aspect of the design in place, but they don't want it to break the bank. So we work together to use the cheapest materials, but not cheap materials, in order to recreate these. So the bottoms and the tops are going to be made out of pressure treated lumber. I know there's different schools of thoughts about using this stuff in your tools. I cut pressure treated lumber maybe 3 times a year, so I use my tools for it. If you do it too much, it can gum up all of your blades because of all the chemicals in it. And basically I just needed to rip these down to the size of the original panels. One dimension was 3 inches and the other was about 2 3/4. So I ripped off about a 1/2 inch from one side and about 3/4 from the other, and then I had some square blanks I could start working with. Now this stuff will crack over time, but the customer that this is for is actually a contractor, so he's used to working with such materials, and he was fine with that because the plus side of pressure treated is that it will last longer, especially in exterior applications. So for the panels, there's actually a place local to my shop that sells these wide cypress panels. I've never worked with cypress before, and I really enjoyed working with it. I'll probably be buying more materials from them again. They called this rough sawn cypress. They were 1x8s, and that's a true dimension. They were actually 1x8s. And they were really flat, and rough sawn was enough that I could take it down pretty quickly with my belt sander. So all I did, since I don't have a jointer, was you saw I hand planed one edge pretty clean, and then I could flip it over and saw it all, and then clean up the edge on the table saw. I've done this many times before in my videos, and I'll say it every time. This application only really works if the panels are fairly flat to start with. If you're trying to do this with cupped or twisted panels, you're kind of asking for trouble doing this on the table saw. So I only do this with panels that are already pretty well clean. Like I said, they called these rough, but to me these were pretty clean panels. And then it was simple. I'm only making 2 of these, and like I said, one's 8 feet and one's 5, so I'm only gluing up 2, and these are 8 feet long, so one of them I'll be able to cut about 3 feet off of, which worked out because you could see in the bottom corner, this one with the knot, the one edge was a little wonky, so that's the side I lobbed off. So just a healthy bit of glue on these, and I can glue them together. I'll let these set up overnight in the clamps. The one you could see on the edge has a little bit of a bow to it, so I just add a bunch of clamps, hammer everything down. And since these are exterior panels, they don't have to be perfect, and I'm going to be cutting out a fair amount of material from the inside of these panels, so I didn't go super crazy with flattening them. Obviously I didn't send them through a planer or anything like that, because it just wasn't going to be worth the time. So the next morning I could come in and remove the glue with a scraper, and then once again I used a hand plane just to take off the high spots. This is a number 7 jointer plane, and if you remember, I made a sled last Christmas for someone who watched the channel, and he gave me a vise for my table saw, my my workbench. Since then, he has gifted me with multiple planes that I use all the time in the shop, so I made out really well on that deal. So Scott, if you're watching, thanks again. I love that plane. I use it all the time. And then I just went through with a belt sander and cleaned these up a little bit. And that's the finished panels, which I was very happy with them. The nice thing about the cypress is, unlike going to the store and getting some pine, the knots are much smaller and they're not as frequent. So I glued these up oversized, and then I could go down and trim them down. The original panels are 13 and 7/8. If you're working with older materials, you're going to notice the numbers are always going to be a little bit different than what you're used to working with in modern times. 13 and 7/8 is usually not a pretty common dimension, but I glued these up to about 14 inches, and then I could just rip them down to size on the table saw, and I would have my panel. So you can see that there's routed edges on both of these quatrefoils, which is the design that's on the panels. So you can't really trace it because it's really easy to get the pencil underneath that panel, and you'll get an inaccurate dimension. So I was originally going to use a router template to make these, but because the arches are almost perfect to the same size as this 3-inch hole saw, that's what I decided to use. It was a much faster process than making a jig for the router and routing them all out. So I started off by drilling these out on my drill press. I was able to do the top and bottom circles, but the middle, no matter how I aligned the head of the drill press and the table of the drill press, it was off by about 1 inch. So I borrowed a hammer saw from my dad, and I used the hammer saw to drill those middle circles, which actually ended up working out being a much faster process than the drill press. So for the longer panel, I only used the hand saw. I've been doing this long enough that I could get a fairly good vertical hole with using a handheld tool, and it wasn't super imperative that they were perfectly perpendicularly drilled holes. So I didn't go all the way through, so I didn't get a bunch of tear out. So you could see I have the marks from the centering bit in the hole saw, so I could just flip these over, line up the centering bit, and then cut through the rest of the way. So then I could place these on top, and the points in the middle are actually curved as well. Now I'm not going to drill these out, I'm going to cut them out with a jigsaw, but I think this was 1.5 inch hole saw, was perfect to mark that arch. So then I had a mark, I could go through and use a jigsaw and cut those out. Now I only had thicker blades in my shop. If you have a thinner scroll saw style blade for the jigsaw, you can cut this in a continuous curve. I kind of had to attack it from both sides, but it ended up working out. And I had my die grinder out because I'm working on another project. So once I had these cut out with the jigsaw, I could go through and take the die grinder and just clean up those curves in the center there. And the original panel sitting on top, you could see it's pretty much a perfect match, and the edge they just cut square. I'm assuming there's a part on the porch railing posts that kind of mate up with that opening. So for the longer panel, I thought I could get away with tracing it, but it's actually different dimensions. These are much wider apart by about 3 or 4 inches. So what I did was, you could see these are the circles I talked about that aren't included in the video. Luckily they popped off, so I could just pop them all off and then just tack them back onto the new panels. So what I did was, I had that on there, I made marks of where the edges of the quatrefoils were. I can make straight lines, and then I could go through with the panel I already cut out and mark up the 8-foot panel. So you could see I could line up the edge with my marks and then mark where those go, because like I said, they're not identical. I could slide it down, line up my marks, which is out of camera view, and do that the whole panel in order to get this lined up. And then I just had the 8-foot panel there to make sure that everything lined up well. I could go through and do the exact same process for the shorter panel on this longer panel with the handsaw. With those marks, just marking I always like to mark the center mark, especially because this bit will drift on you. So if you already have that center mark there, it's easier to drill those holes. And then that's how the longer panel looked. So looking at this, there's a concave and a convex router bit used on either side of the piece. So luckily I had a round over bit that matched, as well as a cove cutting bit, somewhat of a cove cutting bit, in order to cut the concave part. So they match perfectly, which is nice. The orange one is not as good of quality, so you can see it will be smoking a lot. And also where I live, mushrooms are a very big industry, so we have a lot of mushroom farms. They grow the mushrooms in wooden beds. So this company specializes in selling cypress and cedar because they last longer with the wet soil in the beds than other lumbers. So this is not for reproduction purposes, so I don't have a moisture meter, but I also think this lumber was not fully dry. That's not their fault. They sell it for a particular purpose. So I think that's one of the reasons a lot of my tools were smoking during this process as well, just because the lumber was still a little wet. And then that is what that bit looks like. I could flip it over and then do the other one. You could see with the nicer grade bit, it goes a lot smoother. Now this palm router is a new purchase, and I absolutely love it. Unless I have an excuse to use my bigger router, I won't. I had an intern in the shop the past couple of weeks, and he was younger than he was a younger guy, so he wasn't comfortable using a lot of the tools, and I don't pressure people. If you're not comfortable, you should not use them. So the palm router was something I'd wanted for a while, and it was a good excuse to buy one because he was more comfortable using the smaller palm router than my gigantic 3 horsepower DeWalt. And it ended up being a great purchase for the internship as well as myself. I absolutely love it. It's much easier to use on applications like that than the bigger routers. So then I could jump back to the pressure treated lumber. You could see they have the same router bit detailing, the concave side and the convex side, as well as a groove the panel sits into. So the first thing I did was cut that groove. So I put a 3/4 inch Dado stack into my table saw. This is just pointing out a little stub tendon they have on the railing, which he didn't particularly ask for me to add, but I did leave a bit of lumber on the edge. If he comes by and says that's something he needs to install them, I could add it. Did not add it into the video. So like I said, this is a 3/4 inch Dado stack, so I could go through the grooves a little over an inch because it matches the width of my panels, and I could cut a 3/4 inch groove, and then I could just move the fence over and cut another slightly smaller groove, and that will give me my inch groove for the panels. So this is after having moved it over. I could cut it again. And then that is what that groove looks like. So then there's also a little bit of a curve on the top side of the railing. So for stuff like this, I put it on the table saw. I get the angle perfect just by eyeing it up, set the fence perfect just by having it in place. It was about 27 degrees is what I'm filming. And then I could cut the curve. Now this curve's only going on two of these pressure treated beams. It's not on the bottom side, just the top. So that is just that slight angle, and that was all these needed. The angle on the originals was not super finished, so I'm just going to sand the top of these so it's not rough, and that will be the top sides of the pieces. This is just a close-up of cutting that angle. So all in all, this project was what I consider to be a fairly simple project with a little bit of problem solving. I got it done easily in less than a week, and that was with working on some other stuff as well. So then this is going through and adding those router details. I have them all oriented in the same way because, like I said, there's a round over on one side and then a concave cut on the other. So I could go through on one edge and cut all the sides for the round over, and then I could switch the bit and cut on the other side. So then the panel matches with these. So the concave side of the panel will face out towards the concave side of the pressure treated wood. and then I could just fit my panels into place. These fit really well. I had a little bit of planing to do, but they fit really well into place. And then the top fit on pretty well also. So then for these, I just put some clamps on them so that I made sure that they were that panel was all the way down, and then I'm putting some pocket hole screws on the tops and the bottom for my center lines. Now I will admit that this is not normally how I would do this, but this is how it was done on the original panels, and there was no cracking in the panels whatsoever, and they're rather old. So you can see there was actually, I did not know these were there at first because there's some molding that covers those holes, and the screws themselves were not overly rusted or anything like that, probably because the molding holds it, and it was really hard to take these panels apart. So I'm not a lover of pocket hole screws, and I probably wouldn't do this if I didn't know that that was how the original designer or maker built them, but it worked enough on those ones to be good enough to use on this, so that's how I attached it. So the center moldings is something I'm just not going to be able to find in the stores, and like I said, the customer didn't want to spend a ton of money. You could recreate moldings, but he didn't really want to spend the money on that. So I found molding that matched pretty closely at Lowe's, and then luckily 2 of the cutoffs from the tripping down the 4x4s was a 1/2 inch, so I could get the thickness because the Lowe's lumber was only 3/8 by putting that 1/2 inch underneath. And then I just used that same bit in order to cut the cove, the concave cove on the outside edges. Now it doesn't match perfectly. There's an added bead in the Lowe's molding, but he was totally fine with that. It's something that only someone who knows it's there is going to notice once it's painted. So this is just showing you how I did that. I take a measurement because they were pretty close, but with pressure treated lumber that I didn't joint or plane, it's going to have some undulations in it. I could brad nail these in place for the time being. All these are kind of tacked into place because, like I said, I want him to look at them before I permanently attach them. I'll put caulk and glue on all of this stuff before it's finally attached, and then I can just trim it and fit it right into place. And then these are just some photos of what the old panels look like next to what the new panels turned out to look like.